Today I'm speaking with Rupert Spira. Rupert is a teacher of Advaita Vedanta, which is the non-dual teachings of the Indian tradition, and many of you have requested that I speak with him. As you'll hear, we talk at cross purposes for a while. The first half hour or so is more of a philosophical debate than anything else. Depending on who you are, you might love this conversation, or you might hate it. I think some of you will feel that the first half hour in particular is a nightmare of convolutions and hair splitting. We're essentially arguing about whether there's such a thing as the material world, or whether consciousness is, in fact, all that exists. Not much turns on that in the end, but some of you will find it frustrating. Hopefully, however, many of you will find it very interesting and the conversation as a whole very useful. So, with that hope expressed, I now bring you Rupert Spira. I am here with Rupert Spira. Rupert, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Sam. Nice to be here.
We've never met, but people have recommended you to me and your work to me since I launched my Waking Up course. So I actually don't know much about your background, and so I'd like to start there. Just how did you come to know anything about non-dual awareness, and how did you come to the practice of meditation? Who were your teachers? How did you get your start in this racket of understanding the nature of consciousness?
My mother introduced me to non-duality when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
She and my stepfather belonged to a society in London called the Study Society, which had been started by the Russian philosopher P.D. Ouspensky.
Mm-hmm.
And they also held regular meetings in our home. So there were always, throughout my teenage years, people coming in and out of the house. So I was brought up in a kind of atmosphere where these matters were talked about. I met a lot of people, my parents' friends. And at about the age of 16, I started to become interested. And I first went to the Study Society. Used to have a house in London called Collett House that originally Ouspensky had bought and had used for his work. So I went there first, aged about 16, and first saw the Sufi turning, which I was very, very moved by. And a couple of years later, I learnt that and practiced it for many years. But by the time I got there, really, they were no longer studying Ouspensky's teaching. The man who was in charge there, who I really consider to be my first teacher, a man called Dr. Rolls, had met Shantananda Saraswati, who was the Shankaracharya of the north of India at the time. And he was making regular visits to India. So I attended all through my late teens, and in fact for the next 20 years, I attended many meetings at Collett House on a weekly basis, where I was studying the classical Advaita Vedanta teaching. I learnt mantra meditation fairly early on. I think I was 17, and I learnt Gurdjieff's movements at the same time. So during these next 20 years of my life, from kind of my mid-teens up to my mid-30s, my interest and study and practice was really based in the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition. And as I said, at the same time, I was practicing the Mevlevi turning and practicing Gurdjieff's movements. After about 20 years, I felt that I had really gone as far as I could in that tradition. I love the tradition deeply. I loved the Shankaracharya's teaching. I was privately studying Ramana Maharshi on a daily basis through those 20 years. But I felt that there was still something missing. I had a deep intuitive understanding of everything that was being spoken of, but I felt that I hadn't yet really made the understanding my own. And towards the end of that 20-year period of study and practice, I began to feel that I needed to move on. I didn't quite know where to move on, where to go to. I was not on the spiritual circuit at all. I had just been with this one in this one school, this one tradition for 20 years. But shortly after that, I met the man who was then to become my teacher, Francis Lucille.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent the next 12 or 13 years with him, attending retreats, several retreats a year with him, both in Europe and America. And that was, he not only refined my understanding of the Vedantic tradition and made experiential for me what up until then had been intuitive but not really my own felt understanding. He not only refined my understanding of the Vedantic approach, he also introduced me to the Tantric tradition of Kashmir Shaivism.
Mm-hmm.
And that really enabled me to bring the understanding into the way I felt the body and perceived the world. So it was the combination of these two traditions, really. I started on the Vedantic approach for the first 20 years, and then after I met Francis, I continued on that path, but was also becoming more and more interested in the Tantric approach, but particularly the Tantric approach of Kashmir Shaivism, which he had learned from his teacher, John Klein.
Right. Yeah. And I once attended a meeting with Jean Klein. I've never met Francis, but
yes, I never met John Klein.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, so how would you articulate this core understanding of non-duality? And I mean, perhaps we can linger on the difference between what you felt to be a conceptual understanding of it and a more experiential one, and just how is it that you see people transition there, and how did you transition yourself, and what is that like, and then what are the sorts of things you tell your students to make that transition for themselves?
Well, the core understanding of the non-dual understanding in whichever tradition it is expressed, as the name suggests, is simply that that reality is single, that there is a single reality, the duality of between mind and matter, between self and other, between God and the universe, is an imaginary or a conceptual split or division, and that really there is a single reality whose nature is consciousness. And this consciousness is in the non-dual understanding considered to be not only the essence or the nature of ourself, but also the reality of the world.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you're very familiar with expressions from various spiritual traditions, many different expressions. I and my Father are one, the ultimate reality of what I am, and the ultimate reality of the universe are one and the same.
Hmm.
Atman equals Brahman, Nirvana and Samsara, etc. This core understanding that what we essentially are and what the universe essentially is a single, infinite and indivisible whole from which all objects and selves derive their seemingly separate existence.
Hmm. Yes, I'm very familiar with that language and
Yes.
those kinds of claims. I tend to draw a bright line between, in the way I discuss this range of experience, and there's the way I think about it for myself. I draw a bright line between making claims about the nature of the mind, and therefore the nature of experience, and the nature of reality at large. Because it seems to me that we're on very firm ground making first-person claims about what it's like to be us, what it's like to be conscious agents and, consciousness itself. And then we are on fairly speculative, if not shaky ground, making claims about how consciousness relates to the nature of the universe, to the cosmos that we can understand through third-person methods of physics and astronomy and cosmology and the related sciences. So there are many spiritual teachers who I could name, and you may be one of them, who are tempted to say that because of certain things we can notice about the nature of consciousness directly, we can say something about what preceded the Big Bang, or what the underlying fabric of reality is in the physics of things. And that move to me seems generally unwarranted because and certainly vulnerable to the next thing that gets discovered in a physics lab, right? Or the next thing to fall out of some plausible construal of the equations that are trying to unify our understanding of physical reality. And it's also just another empirical fact that we don't know from the mind science side, the neuroscience and related fields, how consciousness is arising, or how, at what point it's integrated in the physics of things. So I'm wondering how you feel simply bracketing the claims about reality at large, or the beliefs we might form about reality at large, and focusing merely on the nature of experience when one recognizes the nature of consciousness from its own side.
But what is it that makes you feel that a scientist is qualified to make observations about the nature of reality, whereas someone who is interested in the nature of consciousness is not similarly qualified? Do you feel comfortable with a scientist making an observation about the nature of reality?
Well, so they could, needless to say, they could be the same person. So you could have, in the best case, you have a scientist who is aware of the kinds of experiential, contemplative methods you and I are beginning to speak about. What can be noticed about the nature of mind from the first person side. And this same scientist is also aware of what can be noticed about the mind and the brain and the world from the third person side. And so,
Yes.
but the problem I tend to have is that first person experience, what it's like to be us in this moment, and what we can notice about our minds and about the context in which thoughts arise and the nature of consciousness, that admits certain kinds of data of which most scientists are scandalously unaware, right? So I mean, to take the
Yes.
criticism from the other side, but most scientists, when they talk about the nature of the mind, don't know anything about the possibility of not being identified with thoughts, and using any kind of introspection to see anything at all of substance. I mean, most scientists think introspection was a dead end, and
Yes.
we were right to abandon it 150 years ago. But conversely, you can't even notice that you have a brain by paying attention to the nature of consciousness, much less understand what it might be doing.
Yes, but one's experience of the brain, and indeed one's experience of anything else, is an appearance in consciousness. In fact, nobody does ever, or has ever, or indeed could ever experience anything outside consciousness.
Yes,
So,
that's certainly true.
a scientist, a materialist scientist's belief that there is something outside consciousness, namely matter, is an unverifiable belief. It's something that it's a model that will never be able to be proven, simply by virtue of the fact that although we have a concept of matter, and although our concept of matter enables science to do many wonderful things, it's not a concept that actually relates to anything in experience. So it cannot be verified. You may also claim that it cannot, by the same token, be falsified.
the thing is, it can be triangulated upon in ways that are suggestive. So, for instance, it's certainly true for me that I will never experience anything directly outside of my own consciousness, right? This is a tautology. I mean, experience and consciousness are synonyms here. And that's true for any given individual. And yet we each know there must be facts of the matter of which no one is currently conscious, which explain the kinds of things you and I can potentially be conscious of.
Absolutely. That I would agree with. But when you said earlier that you're aware of what takes place within your own consciousness, I would say each of us is aware of what takes place within our own mind. And I'm not suggesting, as some people who speak about these matters suggest, that all there is the content of our finite minds. I'm not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that everything there is exists inside consciousness. In other words, consciousness is very much larger than our finite minds. So when you say all I'm aware of is what exists within my consciousness, when you say my consciousness, what makes you think that your consciousness is your consciousness? By which I mean that your consciousness is limited or confined to or located within or generated by your body.
Well, it's,
I understand that the content of consciousness,
yeah.
our thoughts, feelings, sensations, etc., is limited, but I think it a mistake to presume, therefore, that the consciousness with which those limited objects are known and in which those limited objects appear shares their limitations. That is an assumption that a materialist scientist makes, but there's no evidence for it.
The problem I have with that, and again, I'm not taking a hard position against that as being impossible. I guess my agnosticism here is based on the fact that the temptation to make consciousness the first principle is born of our direct experience of it. I mean, I would say, and I've said many times before, that consciousness is the one thing in this universe that can't be an illusion, right? I mean, it is the
Yes.
fundamental datum. It is the
Yes.
medium upon which any other data would be acquired. So consciousness cannot be an illusion. And while we can be confused about many things, I mean, we might be dreaming now and asleep, and
Sure.
we'll wake up and be surprised. We might be brains in vats. We might be in the matrix. There's an infinite number of things about which we could be confused, but we can't be confused about the fact that there's something that is like to be what we are in this moment, that something seems to be happening. And that
Yes.
seeming is what we mean by consciousness. And that seeming has a certain character if you pay attention to it. And this is where the door, in my view, to non-duality opens. But opening that door is not synonymous with gaining an understanding of all possible appearances and how they got that way, right? So it doesn't tell you anything about the origin of stars, right? I mean, yes, it is true that any conception of a star or any experience of looking at it is an appearance in your consciousness or in the consciousness of some conscious being. But we have many reasons to believe, born of our, conversation with one another over now centuries, that the world as we know it preceded us. I mean, this is where the non-dual cosmology begins to seem a little grandiose. I mean, if you just imagine that, we all died off, all human beings died off, and the smartest creature left was a chimpanzee, well, then all of this highfalutin philosophizing would go away. It would be canceled overnight, and consciousness would still persist in the case of those beings, but there'd be no recognition, presumably, of the sort we're talking about. There would just be this ordeal for survival, and there'd be no speculation about the origin of things, and there'd be no temptation if you could trade places with the chimps. I think there'd be very little temptation to say on the basis of those phenomena, consciousness subsumes the reality of the universe. No one's talking about the Godhead if you're just running from a leopard, and that's the highest mind available. And so that's where I feel like it's to extrapolate to the origin of the universe based on what we experience as we look into the nature of our own minds. It just seems unnecessary. You can say all you want about the nature of experience.
You see, I think very differently from that. You mentioned this highfalutin non-dual philosophy. It's materialist philosophy that is highfalutin. Non-dual philosophy is just a simple philosophy that is derived from experience. It is materialist philosophy that is highfalutin and makes grandiose claims. It makes a grandiose claims that there is something outside consciousness, namely matter, which has never been experienced, it could never be experienced, will never be experienced. And moreover, it is believed that the only thing that is ever experienced, namely consciousness, is derived from that which is never experienced. This is philosophy gone to seed. It's madness. That is a highfalutin claim. It's not. I don't really see the difference between a materialist philosopher who believes that there is something called matter that exists independently of consciousness, that precedes consciousness, and moreover gives rise to consciousness, although that nobody has ever found this stuff called matter. I don't see the difference between that belief and a conventional religious belief that believes that an exterior God creates the universe. In fact, if I had to choose between the two beliefs, I would prefer the religious belief, because at least a conventional religious person is honest enough to admit that it's a belief. He says, I believe in God. I have never experienced God. I could never experience God, but nevertheless, it's my belief. And it's not a belief that I share, but nevertheless, I think it is honest. Such a person is simply saying, this is what I believe. Now, a materialist scientist is also appealing to belief. There is something outside consciousness, which nobody has ever experienced or could ever experience, which I believe gives rise to consciousness. And yet most materialist scientists don't have the integrity or the honesty to admit that that it is a religion. It is a religion of materialism. Their philosophy that is based on an assumption. And moreover, they ridicule the people who stay close to the evidence of experience and postulate that consciousness is the ultimate reality of the universe, and who don't feel the need to postulate any other reality, because everything can be explained using the consciousness-only model.
This could be purely a semantic distinction. The temptation to talk about matter is born of this undeniable fact that there seem to be processes at large about which no conscious mind is currently conscious, and yet these processes explain the things we are conscious of. So whether you want to call that matter or more consciousness, that seems to be the same gesture at, there's what we can directly inspect, and there's what we can't or aren't directly inspecting. You and I think, have very similar experiences. We'll agree about the phenomenology of non-dual awareness, right? And yet we're disposed to make different claims about what this means for understanding the nature of reality. What would count for you as evidence against what you're considering a parsimonious take on consciousness being the single mode in which reality appears?
Experiential evidence of something outside consciousness.
But by definition, you couldn't have that, because any experience is consciousness.
And for that reason, it would be very hard to persuade me that there was anything outside consciousness.
It seems fairly parsimonious, again, because you can get general anesthesia and see that that's an unusual experience that has some implications for the possibility that consciousness can be interrupted. I
I
mean,
had in general anesthesia a couple of months ago,
how
actually,
did it seem to you?
and I experienced no discontinuity of consciousness.
So what does that mean? So you were aware of something throughout?
No, there was a discontinuity in what I was aware of, but I didn't have the sense that there had been a discontinuity of consciousness.
And how long was your surgery?
I don't know, half an hour or so.
Okay. So it was a half hour there that you weren't aware of. And yet in that space, there was something being done to you. There were conversations being had. There was somebody controlling the anesthesia. They brought you down. They brought you back. And all of that, it's not contained within the primary field of data that is consciousness in your own case, right? So if we only had your experience to go on, your experience of the cosmos, there would just be this hiatus that would be completely inscrutable. And yet we know you can know by inference, you can know by conversation with others that all of this other stuff happened in those 30 minutes that explain the character of what happened to you. If what happened to you just spontaneously happened, it would be entirely mysterious. You would just lost 30 minutes of life and you couldn't account for it. But here we have all these people who can account for it because they have produced this effect in you. I'm saying that the temptation to be a materialist, whatever word you want to use to describe all of these happenings outside of any one individual's awareness, that is the temptation that we call materialism or physical science. And that is the thing that is producing such an amazing spectrum of effects in terms of making predictions about the kinds of things we will find if we only look. There are all these rooms in the mansion of reality whose doors we haven't opened, and we keep making predictions about what we will find if we do open them. And some of these predictions turn out to be true in that they're conscious agents like ourselves that can authenticate them. But they're true, again, by virtue of the kinds of assumptions that you're recoiling from here. They're not true or very rarely made true by the merely first-person intuitions that anyone can arrive at by virtue of meditation or introspection or direct self-inquiry. There's a different language game that's being played that gets you things like anesthesiologists and all the rest. These are not the sort of data we get in hand merely by paying attention to the nature of consciousness.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, so I think we should just close the door to
Okay.
this particular disagreement because I think it actually
Okay.
doesn't matter. It's interesting that you and I could choose to see things differently at that level, but let's table all of that and just talk about the raw experience of
Okay.
consciousness for a moment. Just assume that I'm a naive subject here. I'm coming to you to understand the nature of the self, the nature of my own mind. I think I have a self, probably somewhere in my head that is thinking my thoughts. That's certainly the author of my thoughts. What do you ask people to notice about the nature of mind?
I would make the observation, first of all, that our experience consists of a series of thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions, and that all of these are continuously appearing and disappearing, but that there was something that knows or is aware of this continually changing flow of objective experience. And I would ask the question, what is it or who is it that knows or is aware of the flow of experience, the continuously changing flow of experience? So I would ask that question to someone who came to this for the first time.
Presumably, many people come to you having practiced some form of meditation.
Yes, that there are a mixture of people. Some people come from various different traditions. They've been practicing for years or decades. Some people, increasingly now with the internet, some people come without having practiced any formal meditation. But irrespective of whether someone has been a Buddhist practitioner for 40 years or someone's just recently discovered non-duality 2 weeks ago on YouTube, I would ask them the same question. What is it that knows or is aware of your experience?
Okay, well, so I will play the incorrigible subject here. So
Okay.
it's me, right? It's
Okay.
me. I mean, I'm aware of my experience, obviously.
Yes. Absolutely. Exactly. I know my thoughts. I am aware of my feelings. I perceive the world. So whatever it is that knows or is aware of experience is what we all commonly call I. And whatever it is that is aware of our thoughts is obviously not itself a thought. Whatever it is that knows our feelings and sensations is obviously not itself a feeling or a sensation. Likewise, our perceptions. So I would then ask, what is the nature of this knowing I? I would ask the person, because they obviously have first-hand experience of their self. So I would ask, what is the nature of the I with which your experience is known?
And what is the gesture of attention that would yield the intended response there?
Well, there's no intended response, really. It's a simple investigation. I would just be encouraging the person to investigate what it is they call their self when they say, I am tired, I am lonely, I am aware of my thoughts. Always I, at the heart of every experience. I would just encourage the person to investigate the nature of that I. After all our thoughts and feelings arise on behalf of ourself, and all our activities and relationships are undertaken on behalf of ourself. And so I don't think that there could be any more important or let alone interesting investigation than to know the nature of the I or the self on whose behalf all our experience arises and all our activities and relationships are undertaken. What could be more important than to know the nature of that on whose behalf our experience takes place?
Well, so then what is the experience of recognizing its nature?
Well, that's what I would ask the person to. I would ask a question, and I would ask the person to tell us what they discover about themselves. I wouldn't tell them. I try not to.
Mm.
I'm sure I do. I definitely do. I speak about the nature of consciousness, but I'm more interested in facilitating each person's investigation into the nature of their own experience so that they come to the recognition themselves rather than have the answer suggested and simply adopt a new belief about the nature of their self. So
Mm.
I would encourage the person to tell us about yourself. Tell us about the one that is aware of your experience. And in order to do that, for instance, if I were to say to you now, tell us about what you are seeing in your room, you would obviously you'd scan your room and you'd describe it. You would give your attention to the objects in your room. If I were to say to you now, give your attention to the tingling sensation at the soles of your feet, again, you would direct your attention to the tingling sensation, and as a result, you would describe it. Likewise, your thoughts, your feelings. But so, in other words, we have to go to the experience that we are trying to find out about. So when we ask ourselves the question, or when the mind asks itself the question, what is it that knows or is aware of the content of my experience? The mind has to actually go to that which is aware of its experience.
The feeling, however, the starting point for almost everyone is the sense that there is a place from which they go. There's a locus of attention, and attention can be aimed at its various objects, and then hence the sense of subject-object duality, right? So you say, well, what does the tingling in the soles of your feet feel like? The default sense is there's me, the attending subject over here, now paying attention spontaneously when you say it
Yeah.
to
Yes.
the experience in the soles of my feet. And that's the duality that one is seeking to undercut by paying attention to this in the first place.
Well, at this stage, I wouldn't be trying to undercut the duality.
Hmm.
At this stage, I'm still accepting that there is a distinction between the subject and the object of
Hmm.
experience. In fact, I'm trying to draw attention to the subject of experience. But because most people believe and feel that it is I, the body mind, that is aware of the world, that the first step I would take is, and that is obviously a position of duality. The body mind is considered the subject of experience and the world the object of experience. So I would keep that frame of reference as a concession. So in reference to that, I would say it is not I, the body mind, that is aware of the world. It is I awareness that is aware of the body mind world. That is thoughts, feeling, sensation, perception. So we're still in duality here. I acknowledge that. This is only a stepping stone. It's one step towards a fuller understanding of who we really are. We're separating ourselves out, not as a body mind, not as a subject which is a body mind. We're saying that the subject of experience is awareness, and what we call the body and the mind and the world are objects of our experience. But as you rightly suggested earlier, there is still a sense that this subject of experience is localized. So although the recognition, I am awareness, is a partial liberation from the belief and the feeling that I am this little cluster of thoughts and sensations called the body mind, it is not the full liberation. It's certainly not what is referred to as enlightenment, because there is a deeper investigation that needs to take place. Having realized I am awareness, the next investigation is, what is the nature of the awareness that I am? Is it localized? Is it temporary? Is it finite? So this would just be a first step. Asking the question, what is it that knows or is aware of my experience, would just bring us to the understanding I am awareness. But it doesn't yet tell us about the nature of awareness, and therefore it doesn't deliver full peace and happiness.
So what is the nature of the freedom on offer in your view? Take a concrete case of psychological suffering, right? So somebody is feeling anxiety or fear or anger or
Yeah.
sadness, and they engage this inquiry. What is there to be realized about the nature of mind, and what is the range of freedom in the midst of those emotions that's available?
Well, if we say, I am afraid, I am anxious, I am sad, in each of these statements, there are two elements of experience. There's the I, and there is the sadness, the anxiety, the loneliness. And the sadness, the anxiety, the loneliness are not essential to us. We are not always sad. We're not always lonely. We're not always anxious. So these elements of experience, that when they're felt, they are obviously deeply felt and very intimate, but they are not essential to us. However, the I that is sad is the same I that is anxious, is the same I that is lonely, that is the same I that is in love the next day, the same I, etc. So the I is the constant factor, the constant element. It is the only element of our experience that is essential to us, or that cannot be removed from us. So that's what I'm interested in. And that's what is what I would encourage people to be interested in.
And presumably by I there, you don't mean the sense of being the thinker of one's thoughts. You mean consciousness itself.
Yes, that which knows or is aware of our experience. that which shines in each of our minds as the knowledge I am, before what I am is qualified or colored by experience. For instance, whatever it is that is aware of your experience now is what you call I. Whatever it is that was aware of your experience when you were a 5-year-old boy is also what you call I. And I presume that what you referred to as I when you were a 5-year-old boy is the same I that you refer to now. Obviously, what you have experienced has changed innumerable times since then, but your basic sense of yourself, the experience I am, is the same now as it was then. In other words, nothing has happened to it through the course of your experience. It is in exactly the same condition now as it was when you were a 5-year-old boy. It hasn't aged, it hasn't been tarnished by experience, it hasn't been hurt, it hasn't been moved, it hasn't been altered in any way.
Well, given how much experience has changed, given how much the contents of consciousness has changed, and given how poor my access is to the contents of yesteryear, I really would be tempted to say precisely the same thing about my I amness and anyone else's, right? I could say the same of yours. You could swap anyone into the place of my 5-year-old self, and
Absolutely.
I'd make more or less the same claim.
But absolutely, that's exactly my point. I agree that if you as a 5-year-old boy had taken the thought I am and had gone to the experience to which that thought refers, and if I had done exactly the same thing as a 5-year-old boy, indeed, if any of the 7 billion of us had taken the thought I am, aged 5, or indeed at any time during their lives, and had gone directly to that experience, that is, to the knowledge of our own being, before it is qualified by experience, we would all go to the identical experience. Take the experience of dinner last night.
Hmm.
That which was aware of your dinner last night, is it any different from that which is aware of your experience now?
Well, it's interesting because on some level, the continuity is an inference born of the contents of consciousness. It's like when you actually drill down on what consciousness itself is like, it could actually be, I mean, you could be reinvented every day or every moment, and it would be compatible with that experience as well.
Take the conversation we were having 2 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also appealing to your memory, but you were aware of our conversation 2 minutes ago. The thoughts have changed, the sensations have changed slightly, etc. But has that which was aware of our conversation 2 minutes ago, is it any different, or has it changed in any way from the awareness which is aware of our experience now? Or is it the same awareness, and is that awareness in the same condition or in a different condition in your experience?
I certainly can't say that it was different, because the only signature of a difference would be something that would be noticed at the level of the contents of
Yeah,
consciousness.
yeah. So we're
Right.
not talking about that now. We're talking about the awareness
Yeah.
with which those different objects was known. Is there any was it the same awareness, for instance? Let's
Well,
not
well, yeah. I
wander.
mean, I think you could certainly claim no difference without even asserting sameness, right? It seems a little bit of a reification to assert that it was the same again, because
What difference between saying that it was the same and that it was not different? Sorry,
uh,
I don't understand that. When you say the consciousness with which I was experiencing my experience 2 minutes ago is not different from the consciousness with which I'm experiencing my experience now. That's
to say that there's no evidence of difference is not the same thing as direct knowledge of sameness, right?
okay.
It's
But is
just
it your
of
experience that you are the same person now that you were 2 minutes ago? The same self, that your being is the same being? Or was it a different person that was having your experience 2 minutes ago?
I can answer that question in two different ways. I mean, on some level, it was a different person, And obviously on some level, it was the same person. There's psychological continuity, but the continuity isn't perfect, right? And that's compatible with a basic feeling of paradox around the nature of personal identity. It is a strange thing to feel that you are the same person who you were 5 minutes ago on some level when so much is lost and so much has changed. And
So what do you think that gives rise to that feeling of always being the
well,
same person?
but the thing that hasn't, I mean, so the thing to which you're pointing, that just the awareness itself, right? When you denude that of all of its objects, all of
Mm,
its contents, all the things that change, well, then that thing is not personal in any sense. I mean, then mine and yours and the
yeah.
monkey's, it's the same thing, right? And so that's not a something that I can say. It's certainly not different, but it's also not a something.
I'm taking for granted that we both understand and that the vast majority of your listeners understand that even by calling awareness, we are falling into a trap of reifying it. So, but of course, we have to speak of it. So, and I know that you understand, and I'm sure most of your listeners.
Well, they might no. Frankly, they might not. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't take that for granted because I don't know at what point people are hearing this conversation for the first time, but it's certainly possible to believe one is experiencing pure awareness and to be doing that from a point of some kind of reification or fixation on kind of the awareness side of things as opposed to the contents side of things. As you know, within Buddhism, there's more of an emphasis on a language around emptiness and non-assertion, and that's on some. I'll grant you, on some level, that's just stylistic, and the experiences of people may in fact be the same, but on another level, the ways of speaking about these things can also just shade the nature of experience. So I'm just trying to get at how things seem to me when I do the considerations you're recommending.
Yeah. No, that fair enough. I understand, of course, that speaking about awareness in this way, giving it you using a noun, for instance, to describe it, I understand it suggests that it is some kind of a thing, and
And an unchanging thing. I'm saying you seem to be encouraging me to view it as an unchanging thing, which advertises its own continuity. And on some level, it's the only signature of continuity for me is occurring at the level of, so if there were no continuity at the level of the contents of consciousness, right? If my memories changed completely, then I could be you. Then we could change places, right? I mean, that's when you ask what it would take for me to become you and for you to become me. Well, subjectively, we would just need to, swap memories and, the trick would be done. And what would it mean to say that, I had retained my awareness and you had retained yours in that case? Awareness is just like space. I mean, what we're denuding it of everything particular. It's just the condition of anything subjective arising at all.
and what would its nature, or what is denuded of all objective content? What is its nature? I understand, of course, that any word we use
Mm.
tends to reify, but let's understand that we don't want to sit in silence for half an hour now. We want to discuss these matters, so let's use these limited symbols and do our best with language to describe from our experience what is the nature of awareness denuded of all objective content.
There, the language that seems most apt to me is terms like open and formless and yet illuminated by everything that does appear. It's inseparable from its contents on some level. I mean, again, one reaches for analogies here, but the best analogy for me is to consider something like a mirror, right? Where the appearances you see on its surface are inseparable from its reflective quality. So you can talk about its reflective quality as its own thing, and you can talk about the appearances as the contents, but on some level, these things are inseparable.
Let's take can we take the analogy of a screen rather than a mirror?
Yeah, sure.
Because a mirror is reflecting something outside of itself.
Yeah.
I think a screen is a more accurate analogy, the screen with the movie or the image that appears on it. To suggest that the image is inseparable from the screen, I think is not quite right. The images cannot exist without the screen, but the screen can exist without the images. So that it is possible to separate the images from the screen.
Actually, a better analogy yet might be, and this is another traditional one, the ocean and its waves,
whichever analogy we choose.
They do seem different to me in this one crucial sense, though, that because the film on the screen, granted, yes, it depends upon the screen. Something's coming from outside once again, but it's also that it's not really an expression of the screen. Whereas with something like waves on an ocean, yes, you can say that the ocean can be pacified and there are no waves for a time, and then the waves come back. But in every case, a wave is inseparable from water. It's an expression of what the water is doing.
When the wave is present,
yeah,
it is inseparable from the ocean. But you can have water without waves. You can't have waves without water. So
right.
Whenever an experience is present, a thought, feeling, sensation, or a perception, it is inseparable from awareness. I would suggest all there is to the experience is awareness itself. There's not even something there that may or may not be separate from awareness. All experience is the activity of awareness. But awareness can exist in the absence of its own activity, just as you can have water without a wave. So in that sense, experience can be separated from awareness. It cannot continue to exist as an experience separate from awareness, of course. But experience is not essential to awareness, just as waves are not essential to water.
So what would you say about suffering and its absence here? Take experiences that seem intrinsically negative, right? Take physical pain or mental suffering. What do you suggest that someone can realize if they're following this inquiry and recognizing that everything that appears is just an expression of awareness? What is the freedom there that can be found?
Well, first of all, I'd make a distinction between physical pain and psychological suffering. You can be miserable with no pain, and you can be in great pain and be happy. So I think it's important to separate those two things. And let's talk about suffering, psychological suffering, and unhappiness, rather than physical pain. I would suggest that the ultimate cause of psychological suffering is the belief that what we essentially are is a temporary, finite, separate consciousness. And by the same token, I would suggest that the ultimate relief from suffering, in other words, the ultimate cause for happiness, is the recognition of the nature of the self that we truly are. In other words, I would suggest that what we call peace and happiness, I'm reluctant to objectify these qualities, but I would suggest that what we commonly call peace and happiness are the very nature of awareness itself, and that innate peace and happiness become veiled when awareness loses itself in its own activity. That is, when we get lost in experience and we seem as a result to become a temporary, finite, separate self.
Well, I think people will understand what it means to get lost in experience. I think by that you mean lost in thought mostly, right?
Or feelings, or sensations, or perceptions. Not just thoughts. In fact, could equally be sensations, either pleasant or unpleasant.
Right. So enamored, yes, just kind of fixated on experience. Yeah.
Or to just where we lose our own being. We lose touch with our own being. In other words, or rather, when I say we lose touch with our being, I don't mean to suggest that we are one thing and our being is something else. Our being, our self-aware being, awareness itself, colors itself in the form of experience and loses itself in its own activity.
Right. So if
The
this,
analogy for this would be an actor. Imagine an actor like called John Smith who assumes the role of King Lear, loses himself in the role so fully that he actually becomes miserable. King Lear, the reason why he's miserable is because he's forgotten that he is really John Smith, who is perfectly peaceful, and he's imagined himself to be King Lear. And as a result of that imaginary identification with the character of King Lear, he suffers. And likewise, the remedy for his suffering is not to improve his relationship with his daughters or his courtiers. It is to recognize his essential nature. I am John Smith. And the minute he recognizes that he is John Smith and not King Lear, his innate peace is restored.
well, so let's see if we can make this more concrete. So here are two kinds of experiences that a person could be lost in. Granted, they're not reducible to merely being lost in thought. There's a sensory component to this, but thought is part of the predicament. So there's something you might really want, and there could be something you might really not want, right? So, physical pain might be the latter. You're in physical pain and you want to get rid of it, and you're worried about it. You're thinking about what it might mean. You have a pain in your knee, and should you see a doctor? You've had this thing for 2 weeks now. Maybe you have a ligament tear. You're Googling online about the anatomy of the knee and growing more worried. And then all of this is anchored to this moment-to-moment sensation that you find unpleasant in your knee. And if anyone asks you how you are, the first thing you're going to do is complain about your knee, and this is who you are or seem to be in each moment. Obviously, the opposite experience would be you getting something, some experience that you have been craving, and in the moment of its fulfillment, the ice cream cone, the sexual experience, whatever it is, the height of your pleasure, there's something about the nature of awareness you're not taking stock of. You're simply fixated on the gratification of desire and the pleasant sensory experience associated with it. In both of those cases, if someone follows your inquiry to its terminus, what is the character of the transition? What happens in pain and what happens in pleasure?
Well, you see, I would make a distinction between the two types of experience that you describe. The pain in the knee. Pain is an intelligent, is an expression of the intelligence of the body. If it was not painful to stick your hand in the fire, if it was pleasant, for instance, we would, it's obvious the consequences. So the experience of pain and the desire to be free of physical pain is not in any way a result of believing that what we essentially are is something temporary and finite. It is a natural conditioning that belongs to the body. Whereas a desire, and not all desires are desires for fulfillment, but the desire to acquire a substance or an object or a state of mind or a relationship is a desire that comes from a sense of lack. I feel incomplete and I want the object, the ice cream cone, the sexual encounter, whatever, to fulfill me, to complete me. So the motivation to be free of physical pain and the desire to be fulfilled by some kind of objective experience are two very different kinds of desire. The
Well, that's
first
interesting.
doesn't depend on the sense of being incomplete, temporary, finite. The second one does.
I'm not sure I follow you on pain, however. So if I have a pain and it's bothering me,
Yes.
many of these pains are not actually giving me actionable information that I can intelligently use. It's not really the wisdom of the body. It's just the negative experience of something that may in fact not be dangerous at all, but it still is nevertheless showing up as unpleasant. And if it's capturing my attention, then the question is there a way to break the link between the physical unpleasantness and psychological? I mean, you made this distinction a few moments ago. There's a distinction between the pain and the psychological suffering that may be attendant upon
Yes.
pain.
So it's for that reason that I say that ultimately physical pain is not the cause of psychological suffering.
Mm.
So the cause of psychological suffering is the feeling that I am incomplete and that I lack something and I need an object or a substance or a relationship to complete me or fulfill me. Now, the feeling that I lack something comes from the sense that I am a fragment. And the feeling I am a fragment goes to the very core of my feeling of myself. When we feel I am a fragment, I am temporary, I am finite, this is a fundamental belief and feeling that we have about ourselves that gives rise to the sense of lack and indeed the fear of death, and initiates almost all our thoughts and feelings and our subsequent activities and relationships. And it's true that when we acquire the ice cream cone or the sexual encounter or whatever it is, the anxiety, the desire, the agitation does briefly come to an end. And as a result, we experience happiness. And the mind wrongly attributes the experience of happiness to the acquisition of the ice cream cone or the sexual encounter. And therefore, when the anxiety or the unhappiness rises again, we tend to go back to the same object or the same activity again, seeking happiness. This is how addiction arises. But I would suggest that it's not actually the acquisition of the ice cream cone or the sexual encounter that delivers happiness. It is the acquisition of the ice cream cone or the sexual encounter that brings the anxiety, the seeking mind, briefly to an end. And as a result of that, our true nature of happiness shines. But what is experienced then, briefly, on the fulfillment of a desire, is our essential nature of pure happiness. Now, in this approach, in other words, our essential nature is the source of the experience of happiness for which all people long above all else. And the vast majority of people seek happiness through the acquisition of objects, substances, meditative states of mind, relationships, activities, etc. In this direct path approach that I speak about, we go directly to the source of happiness in ourselves. We don't go via any kind of objective experience.
And what is happiness?
Happiness would be a positive way of describing the absence of the sense of lack, the natural condition. To call it happiness, I don't really like using the word happiness because normally our idea of happiness is associated with some pleasant experience or some gleeful, some marvelous state. I'm not talking about
joy,
a state of mind. It would be more accurate, I think, to say the absence of the sense of lack or just the ease of being. So something less colorful. I tend to talk about peace more than happiness. It's a little less emotive. Just like the innate peace where there's no psychological resistance and no need to move away from one's current experience.
Right. Yeah, the word one chooses here is important, and it's a problem that all the words have obvious liabilities because happiness, as you say, it has a connotation of
absolutely yes,
some kind of positive peak in affect, like joy and something that would cause you couldn't help but smile. And peace I think peace does get much closer to it, or non-resistance or ease, but there's something lackluster about that. I mean, if you tell people the punchline here is peace, many people think they want much more than peace. They want the good stuff. Peace suggests a kind of acquiescence, and you've given up on the search for the good times and the peak experiences.
The reason I use the word happiness is just because that's the common name that most people use for the thing that they want above all else.
Yeah.
if we were to do a survey of all 7 billion of us and were to ask, what is it that you want? And there'd be a variety of answers: better health, or an intimate relationship, more money, etc., etc. And then if we asked, but why do you want those things? The answer would always be, because I think they will make me happy.
Yeah.
Indeed, if we asked somebody, if you were given the option to win the lottery of $10 million, but that you would guarantee that it would make you miserable, would you want it? We would, of course, say no,
Right.
because it's not really the $10 million we want. It's the happiness we believe will be derived from them. Indeed, even the search for enlightenment. If we were to ask someone, would you prefer to be enlightened and miserable, or unenlightened and happy? We'd go for, I would go for unenlightenment and happy. So even the search for enlightenment is really a rebranding of the search for happiness. It's not really exotic or extraordinary state of enlightenment, whatever we conceive it to be. What we really want is just happiness, or whatever word we're going to use.
So is there a final place that one arrives along this path of inquiry? I mean, what is your experience here of your own growth in this direction? What is your moment-to-moment experience like? And if, we don't tend to talk about it in terms of a goal, but there's some degree of final fruition that we're imagining is possible or not. Where does this all arrive for you?
Forgive me for using religious language here. I'm just going to quote some, I don't even know who it was, who said, when the journey to God comes to an end, the journey in God begins. Just translate the word God into infinite awareness, or whatever. So I think there is something in our experience that corresponds to the recognition of our essential nature, or the recognition of our essential self, that element of our experience that is essential to us, that cannot be removed from us, that we call I or myself. The recognition of the nature of that is something very real. But I think, and in many traditions, that recognition is considered to be the end point. I consider it to be simply a step on an endless journey. That there is one thing to recognize the nature of one's own being, and I think there is quite another thing for that recognition to percolate or infiltrate into all realms of our experience, so that we think, feel, act, perceive, and relate in a way that is consistent with and as an expression of this new understanding of ourself. And I think that is a journey, I hope it is a journey that never comes to an end.
To say that you hope it never comes to an end, you mean you hope it's never finally fulfilled?
No, what I mean is I don't think one could ever get to a stage when one said, I'm a perfect human being. There is no longer any aspect of my experience that is yet to be colonized by my understanding of my true nature. I think there's always the understanding of one's true nature is the recognition of one's own being is the recognition of one's own being. That cannot be improved. But once that recognition has taken place, I think the ramifications of that recognition on all aspects of one's life is never ending.
Why would you assume that, though? Because there was a period in your own life where you didn't have this recognition, right? And then you spoke about it at the beginning of this conversation, where you had a more conceptual understanding of this, and then you had a more direct understanding.
Yes.
So that transition happened, and then this insight began to colonize more and more of your moment-to-moment experience, presumably.
And continues to do so.
Right. So,
and I can't imagine ever getting to a stage where I thought I am a perfect human being, and I've never what exactly that would mean. I can't.
Well, no, but forget about the claim to perfection, but just you can't imagine getting to a place of where this quality of awareness is so obvious that it would be impossible to overlook ever
No,
again?
no, 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 no. Sorry, I'm not. That's not what I meant. I think it is very definitely possible to recognize the nature of one's being, and for that recognition no longer to be eclipsed, or for experience to almost completely lose its capacity to veil
Hmm.
the knowing of our own being. So I'm not suggesting there may not be the odd moment, but I think it is possible for the recognition of our own being to be a stable
Hmm.
experience. What I was referring to more was the implications that has for everyday life, and how the realignment of our objective experience with this recognition,
Right.
I think, doesn't come to an end simply by virtue of the fact that objective experience is finite. It's always changing. So I think there's always room for the development and the evolution of objective experience that is in line with this recognition. So the recognition itself, I think, is something that it can be stable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is just to say that if you didn't know how to play tennis before this experience, you're not going to know how to play tennis after this experience, right? The mastery of tennis is its own thing. That
That's very true. But more specifically, I'm talking about experience that actually expresses the qualities that are inherent,
mm,
if we can call them qualities, in our true nature. So one doesn't have to recognize one's true nature in order to be a very good tennis player. But there are some experiences, there are some activities, there are some thoughts, that feelings that are the inevitable consequence of this recognition. And I think there is no end to the evolution of these experiences, the way we think, the way we feel, the way we act, the way we perceive, the way we relate. These continue to be progressively permeated or saturated with the qualities that are inherent in our true nature.
mm. And finally, Rupert, now I'm becoming, though I am not a fragment and you're not one, I'm becoming mindful of your time. But I just have a final question, or maybe a nested pair of questions here. What is the connection of this inquiry and, the freedom that can be discovered here, and living an ethical life, behaving well among others? And if there is a direct connection, as is often promised in various teachings, what do you make of the fact that there's so many teachers who presumably have had direct experiences of the sort we're talking about, who have just behaved atrociously with their students once they have gotten the power to do so? The litany of abuses, and
Yes,
there are almost more teachers who do not survive contact with the role of being a guru than
yes.
those that do. What do you make of all this?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and that we could have a long and very interesting conversation about that. Not everybody who recognizes their true nature teaches, and not everybody who teaches have recognized their true nature. And I think even the recognition or a glimpse of one's true nature is not enough to qualify one to speak in public about these matters. I think there needs to be a degree of stabilization in this recognition, and that stabilization needs to not just be an interior experience, it needs to be tested in experience, in our outer experience. As I said before, I don't mean to imply by that a teacher is someone who is perfect.
Hmm.
I don't think that, but I think a degree of stabilization in this recognition is necessary to qualify one who is then going to put themselves in a position to speak about these matters, and to put themselves in a position where other people make themselves very vulnerable.
Hmm.
People go to a teacher trust and openness. And the teacher has some responsibility not to abuse that trust. And I think that they need to be mature enough not to buy into the projections that a student inevitably projects on the teacher. There needs to be some maturity at handling these projections and gently turning them round and handing them back to the student, rather than buying into them and allowing oneself to be aggrandized by them, and as a result, the litany of abuses that we're all very well aware of. So, in short, I feel that the teachers that have fallen prey to this were simply not stable enough. They may have had genuine insight. I'm not suggesting that they were all charlatans. There may have been genuine insight, and there surely was in many cases. But I don't think they were stable enough in this understanding to qualify them to speak about it to other people in the role of a teacher.
And what do you recommend people do to stabilize their practice or their insight?
I can only really say what my experience was. As I said at the beginning of our conversation, I met my teacher Francis in my mid to late 30s, and within a couple of years, everything that I had intuited in the previous 20 years of my practice in the classical Advaita school became my lived and felt experience through my association with him. And I remained with him for another 10 years without opening my mouth about these matters. It never once occurred to me to teach. I mean, even now I'm a little reluctant to assume the role of a teacher. I don't really consider myself a teacher. I like to be people's friend, but I understand that what I'm doing is called teaching. But I stayed for another 10 years with Francis, marinating in this understanding and deepening this understanding, realigning my life to the best of my ability, all aspects of my life, family life, my work life, not just my interior life, but my lived and felt experience in the world, while I continued to spend a lot of time with him and the circle of friends that had grown up around him. So I don't think there's a better substitute than that.
So the actual relationship with your teacher, I mean, that's obviously the traditional way of thinking of this is devotion to a guru. Certainly in the Indian context, this is how that would be described. The relationship itself was the primary practice.
No. Sorry, that's not the case. It wasn't a devotion to a guru. It was devotion to the truth.
I might have phrased that wrong.
No, but it's important because the relationship was not the primary vehicle. It was it was a relationship of friendship. Of course, to begin with, I went to him as the vast majority of us do, feeling that I was a student that needed something. But that relationship, it evolved quite quickly into a relationship of mutual love and respect. It was a relationship of friendship. And it was never a devotion to a person or a guru. It was always devotion to the truth. But I stayed around. I spent a lot of time with Francis because I wanted to see, after it had become clear to me that just the nature of myself, and I don't mean to claim by that any extraordinary experience. I just mean just the simple recognition of the nature of my being. When after that had become clear, I wanted to discover what this looks like in life. How do you have an intimate relationship? What's it like to bring up a child? How do you earn your living? I was interested in the practical application of this understanding, and just through spending time with him and other people who I know. established in this understanding, it became increasingly clear in my experience through a kind of like sort of process of osmosis. It was almost a kind of natural process of realignment that took place and continues to take place, but that took place over those 10 years until at a certain point I've just felt this stability that experience, at least to a large degree, had lost its capacity to veil or obscure the knowing of my own being. There was this feeling at some point of just being stable in this understanding.
So the picture I'm getting is that relationship to Francis and the other students, who share this experience, was a kind of primary support for your integrating it into your own mind, moment to moment.
Yes, and of course I was very lucky because in this community and with my friendship with Francis, and likewise in the previous 20 years at Collett House in London, so that's a period of almost 35 years that I was studying and practicing. I did not once and I mean this literally, I did not once for a moment experience any abuse of power or any behavior that was not entirely consistent with the message that was being spoken. So I was very fortunate in that respect.
And do you practice or recommend that others practice periods of deliberate contemplation, seated or walking meditation as a support for stabilizing this? Or is that something that this is Advaita teachers fall on either side of this dilemma. Some acknowledge that deliberate practice is totally convergent with the project of stabilizing this recognition, and others would say that the moment you're attempting to practice, you're simply acknowledging that you haven't recognized this thing, and you're practicing your own unenlightenment. Where do you fall on either side of that question?
No, I think it is entirely legitimate to conduct exercises or to practice in a way, for instance, to help feel the body and perceive the world in a way that is consistent with with this understanding. That there are practices, for want of a better word, that one can engage in to help one feel in this way. There was you probably know this story, a Zen master who on his deathbed was asked by one of his students, how are things for you now, master? And he replied, everything is fine, but my body is having a hard time keeping up. And I think that's a very beautiful answer, a very honest, humble answer. The Zen master, his mind was no doubt open, clear, spacious, at peace. And yet there was some very honest recognition that there was some part of his experience, his body, that hadn't quite caught up with his enlightened experience. And that's the fact that he could say that, the great Zen master on his deathbed, doesn't in any way, for me, undermine his recognition. On the contrary, I find it humble and honest. But I think there are practices, and in fact, this is what I learned so much from the Kashmir tradition, the Tantric tradition of Kashmir Shaivism, because this is not really spoken about very much in the Vedantic tradition. There are practices where one can be helped to actually feel the body and perceive the world in a way that is consistent with the understanding I am ever present, unlimited awareness.
What practices are you thinking of?
Well, that's a conversation in itself. Practices, I divide the teaching into two stages, really. What I sometimes refer to as the inward-facing path and the outward-facing path, or the path of exclusion and the path of inclusion. So the path of the inward-facing path, or the path of exclusion, would be our initial discussion. I mean, in the second half of this discussion, since we've been discussing experience, we started off talking about on the inward-facing path, turning away from the objects of experience and asking ourselves the question, but what is it that knows our thoughts and perceptions? What is it that is aware? So turning attention away from the content of experience towards that which knows them. That is the path of excluding objective experience, the inward-facing or selfward-facing path. And I think this is really the great contribution of the Vedantic tradition to the spiritual tradition. But they don't say very much about they tend to be, at best, they ignore the body and the world. At worst, they positively deny it. Whereas in the Tantric approach, as you know from Dzogchen Buddhism, it's a path of inclusion. It's a path in which all objective experience is included and turned towards rather than turned away from. So there's not time now to go into detail, but it would be an approach where we start with the recognition of our true nature. So we have already recognized, at least to a degree, that I am the open, empty, space-like presence of awareness within which all my experience arises. And all experience is met, as it were, from that perspective. So experience is welcomed, brought closer, rather than pushed away. And there is a gradual permeating. If you put a dry sponge in a bowl of warm water, the water gradually percolates into the sponge. If you put a sugar cube in a cup of tea, the sugar cube will be initially permeated and in time dissolved by the tea. So it's the same with the sensations of the body, particularly the sensations of the body, because the felt sense of separation is really the deeper core of the sense of the separate self. So that particularly all the sensations